Hey guys, tonight we drift into the stone-cobbled silence of Renaissance Italy, a world where marble angels spit water from their mouths, where laundry flutters like gossip in the breeze, and where the fountains hum their watery lullaby long before the first church bell rings. You stand in the middle of a sleepy piazza. It's early morning, still dark enough for the stars to argue with the street lamps. A single jet of water gurgles from a sculpted lion's mouth into a moss-ringed basin. You dip your hand in, it's cold cleaner than you'd expect, and tastes faintly of metal and mountain air. The city isn't awake yet, but the fountain is. It's always awake. Meanwhile, the thought of a warm bath, forget it. The nearest proper bathhouse burned down in the 1400s and was never rebuilt. You can try your luck with a bucket in the courtyard, but even that feels like a social risk. The Renaissance is many things. Brilliant, colorful, unbearably dramatic, but squeaky clean is not one of them. And here's the kicker, you probably won't survive this city if you trust the wrong pipe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past quiet workshops and shuttered bakeries. The streets are still damp from last night's scrub down though. Scrub here might be a generous word, more like drizzled perfunctorily with water. In the dark, you can almost pretend the city smells fresh. Florence, 1480s. Venice. Siena, Rome. Pick your marble-laced city-state, the story's mostly the same. By day, it's a rush of sandals and shouting and frescoes that gleam like polished gems. By night, it's hush and water trickling through centuries-old pipes, singing to no one in particular. But here's the strange part, even as cities grew richer, fatter with silk and sin baths remained rare while fountains multiplied. You'd think they'd go hand in hand if you have water. Surely you use it to clean your sticky Renaissance feet. But no, Italy, land of genius, decided to pour its water into singing statues rather than soapy tubs. Public fountains weren't optional, they were lifelines. Cities had no underground plumbing in homes, unless you were absurdly wealthy, and even then it was sketchy. So every neighborhood had its fountain. Some were simple spouts, others were theatrical spectacles, nymphs and lions and Poseidons in full dramatic flair. The richer the square, the more majestic the water show. And they weren't just about thirst. They marked territory. A family's coat of arms above a fountain meant, we paid for this. You owe us your hydration. You lean on the stone lip of one, now watching a sleepy woman fill a jug the size of a cannonball. She's mumbling something about the neighbor's goat. Apparently, it keeps knocking over her laundry. You nod sympathetically. It's too early for goat-based politics. In the distance, another fountain gurgles. Fountains never competed, they harmonized. The sound was everywhere, a soft splash as background music to the Renaissance. And yet, while you could drink in public, bathing had slithered out of fashion like a snake at a Sunday picnic. In fact, there are almost no public baths left in most cities by this point. Rome, once home to imperial complexes big enough to house indoor swimming coliseums, had let its great bathhouses rot. Bathing wasn't just rare, it was suspect. A person who enjoyed a hot soak was probably morally questionable, maybe even French. But that's a story for later. Right now, you're noticing how many people pass by this fountain. They don't just drink, they linger, chat, fight, sell fish. A fountain isn't just plumbing, it's a stage, a slice of communal life, and everyone's thirsty. You see a boy dipping a wooden bucket. He's careful not to drop it. This water isn't free, even if it flows constantly. Someone pays for its upkeep, usually a wealthy patron. You'll meet a few of them later, powdered wigs and all. They fund fountains like modern billionaires fund space rockets. Except instead of launching into the sky, they gushed into the plaza. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance obsession with fountains was practical, theatrical, or purely political. Probably all three. What's certain is this: the more power you had, the wetter your statue. Tonight, we'll follow those pipes. Not just the marble and myths, but the squeaky valves, the paranoid popes, the rogue engineers, the rumors of ghosts in the cisterns. You'll see how bathwater became scandalous, and why standing under a decorative stream in public might get you fined, excommunicated, or both. And you'll begin to notice something odd. The fountains are always clean, shining, decorated. The water flows day and night, but the people, not so much. Your boots squish faintly as you wander off. The water beneath the city runs through forgotten channels, ancient aqueducts carved by Roman hands. You don't see it, but you can hear it just beneath the cobblestones, whispering, laughing maybe, and high above an old gargoyle drools steadily into a bronze basin. Someone has tucked a flower behind its mossy ear. It's smiling, or maybe that's just erosion. Either way, you're starting to realize this is not just a story about plumbing. It's about pride, fear, marble envy, and the fine line between staying hydrated and getting into serious theological trouble for washing your armpits too enthusiastically. Welcome to Renaissance Italy. You follow the trickling sound down a narrow alley, stone slippery with centuries of stories. The sky's brightening, but the street still smells of wine horse and last night's overcooked onions. A baker stokes his oven somewhere nearby, but it's the sound of water that draws you deeper. The fountain here isn't grand, just a chipped lion head wedged into a wall, but it's older than anything you've ever touched. Probably Roman bones underneath it, maybe even Roman plumbing. And that's where this all begins, with the Romans. See, Renaissance Italy had a weird inheritance problem. It wasn't gold, it wasn't art. It was water infrastructure. Ancient Rome had built an empire on aqueducts, those glorious stone monsters that marched across hills and valleys, bringing fresh water from distant springs into the belly of the city. 9 major aqueducts, hundreds of miles of tunnels, pressure-regulated systems, gravity-fed fountains. It was an engineering marvel. They piped water not just to drink, but to bathe, to cook, to wash, to cool off in public leisure spaces like the Thermae of Caracalla, where you could get a massage, a gossip session, and a soak in a steamy caldarium all before lunch. But then barbarians, earthquakes, neglect. By the 6th century, Rome's aqueducts had crumbled like overbaked biscotti. Some were sabotaged by invading Goths, who thought water was for losers. Others just fell apart from centuries of political chaos and underfunded maintenance. The pipes cracked. The fountains ran dry. Fast forward to the 1400s and the Renaissance rolls in like a peacock on parade. Wealth, art, innovation all flooding back, but the plumbing still mostly ancient, mostly broken, and wildly unpredictable. So here's the paradox. Florence, Venice, even parts of Rome, they had Renaissance brains but crumbling Roman pipes. Imagine rebooting an iPhone with a Roman candle. That's how it felt, trying to revive old aqueduct systems while keeping cities running. And the best parts of Roman plumbing, the baths, gone. The fountains, though, they had a chance. They required less infrastructure. Just a restored pipe, a central spring, a bit of gravity, maybe a lion head, spout for flair. So cities focused there first. Rebuild the public fountains. Keep people hydrated. Let art bloom on marble slabs while bathhouses stayed shuttered and suspicious. You pass a wall with faded carvings, a Latin inscription about an old aqueduct route now repurposed to water a bishop's garden. Classic Renaissance move. Reuse a Roman marvel, slap a holy name on it, and call it a day. But you start to notice something else, how rarely anyone actually talks about the baths anymore. Even in Letter City records, architectural drawings, fountains are everywhere. Baths are ghosts. That's because nobody wanted to admit the truth they had no idea how to fix the bath system. Sure, Renaissance engineers could raise domes and design flying buttresses, but ask them to patch up a 1,000-year-old sewer line beneath a basilica. Forget it. You'd have better luck training a pigeon to fix a pipe. Historians still argue whether the loss of Roman plumbing was an actual engineering failure or more of a psychological surrender. Did they really forget how the aqueducts worked? Or were they just overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all and afraid to dig too deep and break something worse? Instead, they built fountains. Pretty ones. Loud ones. Even musical ones that burbled in sync with choral chants. They made them into symbols of pride, patronage, and piety. Meanwhile, the bathhouses crumbled. You spot a boy with soot-smudged cheeks washing an apple in the lion-mouth fountain. He's careful not to touch his lips to the spout. Everyone says the water's clean, but, well, you know how rumors spread. And oh, the rumors. Some claimed the old Roman baths were haunted, that spirits of the unwashed dead lingered in the ancient pools. Others whispered of demons living in dry pipes. One particularly juicy tale told of a bishop who bathed once and caught the French disease just from the steam. He exploded 2 weeks later. Well, not literally, but his reputation did. So fountains it was. Fountains didn't require nudity. They didn't demand architecture with heating systems or underground channels or moral compromise. They just needed gravity. Even the Vatican got in on the fountain frenzy. Popes commissioned elaborate displays, some powered by reviving bits of ancient aqueducts. Others pumped water using ingenious Renaissance-era hydraulics, basically spinning wheels powered by river flow. The water that had once filled a Roman bath now danced from the mouth of Neptune, rebranded and sanitized theologically, not bacterially. You stop beside a small plaque. It's half erased by rain, but it reads something like Fontana della Misericordia, restored 1462 with funds from the Guild of Wool. A wool guild paid for this water feature, probably as penance for dumping dye waste into the Arno, but also to remind you they control the flow of water, of commerce, of cleanliness, and of course there was competition. Neighboring districts raced to outdo each other. One family would build a lion fountain, another would respond with a cherub. Next thing you know, someone's installing a full-on sea monster spewing water from its nose. Cleanliness might have died, but style thrived. Even if you couldn't wash yourself, at least you could watch water arc into a marble basin while you reeked of garlic and ambition. And slowly the city adjusted. People stopped expecting bathhouses. They wore heavier perfumes. They powdered their wigs. And they gathered at the fountains like moths to moonlight. By now, the street around you is alive. Boots slap the stones. A monk passes muttering prayers. Someone's yelling about missing goats again. And in the middle of it all, the fountain keeps singing. No baths, but always water. Always pride. Always something beautiful to distract you from how badly you need a scrub. You wander deeper into the heart of the city, past laundry lines swaying like lazy flags of surrender, and shutters that creak open one by one as if Florence itself is still waking from a dream. Ahead, a crowd gathers not around a preacher or a painter, but a newly restored fountain shaped like a dolphin wrestling a cherub. You've seen stranger things. The year is 1485, and you've landed right in the middle of a hydrological crisis disguised as an art contest. Here's the thing, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Italy's waterworks didn't vanish overnight. They decayed gradually like spoiled cheese. During the early Middle Ages, people still used the remnants of Roman infrastructure. Some aqueducts continued to function barely. Others were cannibalized for building materials. And some were simply forgotten, hidden beneath vines and superstition. Bathhouses, which once gleamed with polished marble and steamed with civility, became havens for vagrants' illness and the occasional sword fight. By the 1200s, what was left of Roman sanitation had mostly rotted away. The pipes were blocked, The heating system's broken, and the philosophical mood had shifted. If your body needed cleansing, so did your soul. And no one had figured out how to scrub sin off your skin with a sponge. Now, fast forward to the Renaissance. Suddenly, everyone's flush with ambition. Guilds are sponsoring cathedrals. Merchants are commissioning portraits of their dogs. Poets are rhyming about everything from sausages to the stars. There's an explosion of civic pride. But the plumbing, still a mess. You reach a small courtyard where a plaque reads, "This fountain restored by order of the Signoria, 1479. May its waters run pure." They really hoped for that, but reality. The pipes used to restore these fountains were often scavenged from Roman ruins or patched with wood and cheap lead. Water pressure fluctuated like a drunk trumpet player. Sometimes the fountain spat air. Other times it exploded in a flood of frogs and rust. City leaders tried to fix it. They created new offices, Maestri delle Acque, to manage water supply. These men were part engineer, part politician, part alchemist. They mapped old aqueducts, redirected springs, and designed new pipes. Their reward: constant blame when fountains went dry and no one could flush their chamber pot without divine intervention. Still, they made progress. Little by little, fountains came back to life. Not because of hygiene, mind you, but because of civic image. To understand why fountains were chosen over baths, you have to understand the Renaissance obsession with appearances. You see, a bath is private. It happens behind closed doors, hidden and increasingly suspicious. A fountain is public. It's visible, sculptural. It can bear a family crest. It can impress visitors. It can make you look like you care about the city, even if your back garden reeks of pig grease. And when cities rebuilt themselves after fires, floods, or plagues, they didn't prioritize rebuilding public baths. They built piazzas, they built towers, they built statues. And smack in the middle, always a fountain gurgling proof that life like water flows on. Historians still argue whether this rebuilding process was deliberate urban planning or just chaotic reaction. Did cities truly choose fountains over baths? Or did baths just quietly fail while fountains made better marble canvases? Either way, the outcome is clear. The water went to the piazzas, not the tubs. And it wasn't just a question of beauty. There was a lingering belief, half science, half folklore, that water could carry disease. And stagnant water like that in a bath was especially suspicious. People feared it seeped through the skin and carried illness straight into the bloodstream. Cleanliness was dangerous if done improperly. Fountains, on the other hand, were in motion. Flowing, bubbling. You didn't sit in a fountain. You didn't soak. You gathered, you filled your jug. You listened to the city breathe through water. You pass a baker carrying a wooden pail. He nods to the fountain like it's a neighbor. It practically is. He's probably filled that same bucket at that same spout since he was a boy. And here's a curious twist: some cities banned private water access altogether. If you wanted water, you had to walk to the fountain. Why? So everyone could be seen. So the poor mingled with the rich. So the church could observe. So no one stockpiled. And most importantly, so water remained a communal experience. You sip from a leather flask. The water is surprisingly cool. Maybe it came from a spring 10 miles away. Maybe it trickled through an old Roman tunnel lined with prayers and moss. Maybe it passed under a monastery where monks whispered over it. It's hard to say, but it's not from a bathhouse. That you can be sure of. And yet, even as cities funneled money into fountains, you can still feel the awkwardness around cleanliness. People wanted to be clean, but only within the strange boundaries drawn by church tradition and superstition. So the compromise was made. Skip the tub, fund the fountain, let the water flow in public, but keep the scrubbing private, preferably with a cloth, some wine, and a little denial. You watch a girl splash her face in the basin, laughing at the chill. She's cleaner than most people you've seen all morning, But then she walks off barefoot through a street full of donkey droppings. So, you know, net hygiene impact questionable, and yet, the fountain is beautiful. You step back admiring the stonework. A dolphin curls around a seashell basin. Above it, a winged cherub aims a jet of water that sparkles in the light like liquid silver. It's not a bath, but it's something. You slip into a quieter part of the city where the buildings lean in like they're sharing secrets, and the fountain at the end of the alley looks almost shy, just a small trickle from a scallop-shaped spout into a worn stone bowl. Still, it's there. You glance around and realize something strange. No one is naked. No one is soaping up. And if someone were bathing in public, it would probably start a scandal that echoed louder than the cathedral bells. Welcome to the paradox of Renaissance Italy in a society obsessed with classical beauty, frescoed torsos, and sculpted gods in the nude, the actual human body. Your body wasn't supposed to be seen. Not like that. Not wet. Not vulnerable. And this, dear listener, is where the church steps in. You probably already suspect it, but yes. Part of the reason there were so many fountains and so few baths is because public bathing got tangled up with sin. Once upon a time, especially in the early medieval period, communal bathhouses were tolerated, even encouraged in monastic communities. A good wash was considered spiritually and physically healthy. Some monks even bathed weekly, luxurious. But then things started to shift. As cities grew more crowded and morally panicked, the idea of shared bathing spaces began to raise ecclesiastical eyebrows. The nudity, the touching, the lingering. It all felt a bit Roman, and not in a flattering way. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the church had long since cooled on the idea of bathhouses. They were seen as dens of temptation, places where bodies were not just revealed, but celebrated. And if there's one thing that makes a bishop sweat harder than a Turkish steam room, it's the celebration of nakedness. So moral panic sets in. Bathhouses, especially those left over from earlier centuries, start attracting gossip. Who's going? Why are they going? Who are they meeting? Are they leaving cleaner or corrupted? Eventually, laws start appearing. Restrictions, then closures. In some cities, the bathhouses are outright banned. In others, they slowly fade away, repurposed as warehouses or brothels, or, in at least one case, a theater for very confusing puppet shows. Historians still argue whether the bathhouse bans were truly about morality, or just convenient ways to clear out spaces that no longer functioned well. After all, if a structure is falling apart and you don't have the funds to repair it, branding it sinful is an efficient way to end the conversation. Either way, the public bath dies a slow, steamy death, and in its place the fountain rises. You hear one now, not a roar, but a whisper. A soft trickle behind an apothecary's shop. It's framed by ivy and the broken nose of a Roman god, probably Apollo, based on the stylish curls. No one's bathing, but everyone's watching. That's the thing about fountains, they're safe. You can admire water. You can cup it. You can sprinkle a few drops on your face, but you can't take off your clothes. And in a society walking the tightrope between artistic celebration and theological terror, that balance mattered. The Renaissance loved to paint naked people, but real naked people, that was different. So fountains became the compromise. They allowed for civic beauty, public access to water, and symbolic purity, all without the threat of a bare backside ruining the neighborhood's moral compass. You pass a small plaque. It's etched in Latin, but roughly translates to, "Let this water cleanse your thirst, not your shame." Subtle, huh? And it wasn't just the church putting pressure on cleanliness. Families wanted reputations untarnished. Women in particular were expected to be spotless in virtue, but not necessarily in the bathtub. The less one saw of the washing process, the better. Perfumes and powders took over. We'll get to that later. For now, just know this: you are expected to smell clean, without ever really getting clean. There's a story possibly exaggerated, but very Renaissance in flavor of a noblewoman in Siena who was so devoted to modesty, she had a wooden screen built around her washing basin, even though she was the only one in the room. The servants had to pass soap under it like contraband. Another tale tells of a young monk caught trying to use the monastery's rainwater basin for a full-body cleanse. He was reassigned to scriptorium duty with no parchment privileges for a month. And yes, some people still bathed at home, but rarely. It was expensive. Heating water took time and wood. And without proper drainage, you were essentially soaking in a future plumbing disaster. So city officials and religious leaders quietly agreed on an unspoken rule: keep the water public, keep the body private, fountains for everyone, baths for no one. And slowly generations grew up without the expectation of shared washing. What once was normal chatting while scrubbing your elbows with neighbors became unthinkable. Now if someone stank, they wore more fabric. If their hair was greasy, they tied it up in a ribbon. And if their conscience felt dirty, that's what confessionals were for. You reach another piazza now, bigger, louder. The central fountain is dramatic angels, dolphins, maybe even a sea serpent if you squint. A group of children plays nearby, tossing coins and daring each other to touch the statue's tongue. This is where water lives now, not in tiled rooms with steam and soap, but in marble basins beneath open skies watched by saints and sinners alike. It's strange, isn't it? The Renaissance birthed anatomy studies, surgical tools, scientific inquiry, and yet still thought soap might summon lust. But don't worry, you'll meet the perfumers soon. They've got your back, and your armpits. The sun's climbing now, warming the rooftops and curling the edge of a parchment poster nailed to a wall, a sketch of a new fountain supposedly funded by some silk guild eager to outshine the leather merchants. You squint up at it. Angels, lions, maybe a fish. It's hard to tell Renaissance artists loved mashing symbolism and seafood together. But the message is clear: this fountain isn't just a water source. It's a status symbol. You keep walking, and gradually you start to notice a pattern. The fancier the neighborhood, the fancier the fountain. In the rich parts of town, water spouts from intricately carved gods, mythological beasts, and winged putti blowing kisses in stone. In the poorer quarters, the fountains are simpler, just basic spouts over a shallow trough. The water's the same. The stone isn't, because here's something no one likes to admit: in Renaissance Italy, fountains were political weapons. You might think water is a universal need, something that unites people. But in Florence, Siena, and Rome, water distribution was also a way to flex power. If your family or guild paid to build or restore a fountain that meant something, that meant you mattered. And if your neighborhood didn't have a fountain, well, better start cozying up to someone who could build you one. You pause in front of an elaborate basin framed by two statues. One looks like Neptune, the other a local duke with a permanent grimace. This isn't subtle. See, wealthy patrons weren't just funding fountains out of civic duty. They were branding the city, literally carving their names and family crests into public works that thousands would use every day. It's like putting your face on a bottle of water and handing it out for free, except instead of a plastic label, it's immortalized in marble. This wasn't new, by the way. Even the ancient Romans did it. But the Renaissance took it up a notch. With fierce rivalries between families like the Medici and the Pazzi, even something as innocent as a public spigot could become a tool of dominance. One neighborhood might suddenly have 3 fountains built in a single year, not because they were particularly thirsty, but because their benefactor had just been snubbed at a wedding. Historians still argue whether these fountains actually improved daily life, or just shifted the city's plumbing priorities to whoever had the most gold leaf on hand. But here's the twist: fountains weren't just about showing off, they also allowed control. Control over who got water, control over how much, control over where. Some fountains had schedules. Only certain hours of the day would they flow. Others had secret valves controlled by a local official who could literally turn off your water if you'd offended the wrong bishop. You overhear an old woman grumbling to herself as she fills a jug. 2 hours early, she mutters, and the Silk Guild already drained it dry. She's not wrong. Sometimes guilds rerouted water to their dyeing workshops, leaving little for local households. So you begin to understand why water distribution was so emotionally loaded. It wasn't just about hydration. It was about pride, access, and resentment. And still, despite all the frustration, no one's asking for a bathhouse. There's no movement to rebuild the old communal tubs. No signs demanding warm water for sore backs. Instead, people accept the system as it is. Fountains are public. Baths are either private for the absurdly rich or simply non-existent. You reach a crossroad where 2 fountains face each other like feuding cousins. One has a solemn Virgin Mary holding a lily. The other features Bacchus, the god of wine, laughing mid-burp. Guess which one's busier? That's the strange, contradictory beauty of the Renaissance. Religion and indulgence sit side by side, sacred and secular splashing from the same pipe, and beneath it all power. Water was power, and in a hot, crowded, perfumed city, water was also currency. There's a record from Siena in which 2 rival families got into an actual courtroom battle over a diverted water channel. The judge ruled in favor of the side who'd promised to build a new statue of St. Catherine. Legal bribery, Renaissance style. Another case tells of a fountain that was built facing away from a neighborhood out of spite. Yes, someone paid extra to install the spout in the opposite direction, just to make their rivals walk farther for water. You chuckle? Petty, yes, but also incredibly on brand. The Renaissance wasn't just an age of genius. It was an age of glorious pettiness, marble revenge, and political water fights, dressed up as civic virtue. You pass a boy carrying 2 sloshing buckets on a yoke. He's barely 10, but he walks like he's carrying the world. Water is heavy. And the closer your house is to the fountain, the better your life. That's why real estate near fountains got pricey. Proximity meant status, efficiency, safety, and if nothing else, cooler wine. You pause again, watching water splash onto the worn lip of a basin. The statue above it wears the stern face of a long-dead guild leader now immortalized with algae creeping up his chin. You wonder what he'd think knowing his legacy is now mainly feeding pigeons and stray cats. And yet his fountain still works. It still draws people. Still spills clear water day after day. No bath, no soap, just flow. You follow a stone path that twists behind a church where shadows cling to the corners, and the air smells faintly of incense and overripe grapes. Up ahead, a larger-than-life stone centaur spits a lazy arc of water into a pool shaped like a scallop shell. It's elegant, sure, but the alley you just stepped through, absolutely filthy. Which brings us to another unfortunate truth about Renaissance Italy. For all its fountains, the cities were disgustingly dirty. You'd think, given how obsessed they were with public water displays, someone might have said, "Hey, let's also clean the streets." But nope. The contrast between beautiful fountains and revolting alleyways was jarring and common. The same banker who paid handsomely for a cherub-shaped water spout might dump his household waste straight into the gutter. It wasn't that people didn't want cleanliness. It's that no one could agree on who was responsible for it. City sanitation laws existed. In theory, there were fines for dumping refuse in the streets, rules about where you could empty chamber pots, instructions for how to dispose of rotting vegetables, fish guts, and you guessed it, human waste. But enforcement inconsistent at best, corrupt at worst. And so the Renaissance became a contradiction. Gorgeous fountains spraying fresh water in one plaza and a literal pile of donkey droppings steaming in the next. You stop and watch a maid scrub a step with a bucket of water she probably fetched from the last fountain you passed. She's working hard, but the mud seems to fight back. A cart rolls by, tossing more grime into the mix. Her efforts dissolve in seconds. Cleanliness was a battle you fought every day and lost by nightfall. What makes it more absurd is how wealthy some of these cities were. Florence, for example, was drowning in gold florins. Rich merchant families had palaces with silk curtains and imported spices, but indoor plumbing rare. Even wealthy homes often relied on chamber pots, courtyards, and if they were lucky, a private pipe connected to a public water supply, one that might be shut off during a drought or political feud. And so even the rich were filthy rich, emphasis on filthy. There's a well-documented case of a Florentine noblewoman complaining that her husband refused to fund a cleaner for their courtyard latrine, even though they owned 5 vineyards and commissioned a painting from Botticelli. Historians still argue whether this disinterest in domestic hygiene was due to ignorance, arrogance, or a deeply rooted belief that the body, especially when hidden behind wealth, didn't need as much attention. And then there were the streets. You walk now along a narrow passage where the stones glisten not from rain, but from a thin film of grease and waste. It's unpleasant. A chicken scurries past, flapping indignantly. During the Renaissance, it was common practice to throw refuse out the window. Some homes had designated filth flingers who'd shout warnings before tossing contents into the alley below. Attend to a polite version of incoming, but not everyone gave warnings. Some just dumped, which meant walking through a Renaissance street was a gamble. Would you enjoy the scent of fresh bread, or find yourself dodging yesterday's stew? And despite this, fountains still sparkled, still flowed, because they weren't just about cleanliness, they were symbols. They represented order in a city constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. They were oases of control, polished and manicured, while the rest of the city muddled through waste and decay. There's a strange comfort in it, like a Renaissance version of a motivational poster. Yes, the streets are a mess, but look at our fountains. You stop by a small one tucked in a courtyard behind a tavern. Its water trickles gently, and next to it sits a faded stone bench. A pair of lovers occupy it, whispering, sharing a peach. They ignore the rats scurrying nearby. The fountain makes them feel like this place still has dignity, and sometimes it did. During festivals or religious holidays, cities would scrub down their streets, decorate fountains with flowers, even tint the water with wine. One source claims a Roman fountain once ran with red wine during a papal celebration, though scholars debate whether that was literal, symbolic, or just enthusiastic exaggeration. Still, these moments were rare. More often than not, the daily grind overwhelmed sanitation efforts. You pass a butcher's stall, now it's runoff leaking into the gutter, blending with the overflow from the nearby laundry vat. The city has its own smell, rich, earthy, tangy, with a hint of moldy cheese and desperation. And through it all, the fountains continue. Elegant, elevated, slightly smug. You wonder if people saw them as reminders of what the city could be. A version of Florence, or Rome, or Siena that was clean, balanced, harmonious, if only someone would mop the other 99%. Or maybe the fountains were a distraction. Look here, they seem to say, not there. Ignore the pig carcass behind you and admire this winged angel vomiting water into a shell. One fountain even had an inscription carved below it. May your thirst be quenched even if your sandals stay stained. Brutally honest. You shake your head. The Renaissance didn't lack brilliance. It lacked bleach. But even amid the filth, people still gathered at the fountains. They still smiled, filled their jugs, made jokes, met friends. Water brought people together, even if the streets tried to tear them apart. You duck under a low archway where ivy creeps along the stones like nosy neighbors eavesdropping on centuries. The alley opens into a small courtyard just big enough for a single tree, a cracked bench, and of course a fountain shaped like a goat with oddly expressive eyes. Its mouth pours a thin stream of water into a bowl that smells faintly of moss and old copper. At first glance, it's quaint. At second glance, a little unsettling. Because this isn't just plumbing, it's protection. In Renaissance Italy, water wasn't merely physical. It had spiritual properties. And the idea that water could be possessed, cursed, or even haunted wasn't some fringe belief, it was practically common sense. Let's start with the pipes. Roman aqueducts had been marvels of engineering, but by the 1400s they were shadows of their former selves, cracked, rerouted, or entirely buried. Renaissance plumbers didn't just fix pipes, they feared them. There were tales of workmen uncovering old channels and hearing whispers from the stone, or falling ill after tampering with blessed springs, or, in one memorable case, unleashing what locals swore was a demon trapped in a bronze valve. Did anyone see the demon? No. But did it coincidentally storm for 3 days after the pipe burst open and the church bell rang backwards? Yes. And that was enough to cement the story for generations. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were rooted in genuine fear or just served as convenient explanations for engineering failures. But fear spread fast, especially when you considered the water sources. Springs were considered sacred or cursed, depending on who you asked. Some were said to cure infertility. Others were rumored to cause madness if drunk under a full moon. One spring near Bologna had to be blessed annually because locals believed it remembered ancient sins. And underground cisterns, dark, wet, echoing, basically nature's haunted basement. You pass a grizzled old man scooping water into a cracked ceramic jug. He mutters a short prayer before drinking per l'anima non per il corpo, for the soul, not the body. Just in case. And let's talk about fountains themselves. Some were believed to be alive, not metaphorically, but actually responsive to emotions or events. One fountain in Naples was said to overflow if a nearby wedding was cursed. Another in Rome was called La Piangente, the weeping one, because its stream would sputter when someone in the parish died, provided the person had lived with a heavy conscience, whatever that meant. And when pipes burst or dried out, it wasn't always blamed on erosion or faulty stonework. Sometimes people whispered about vengeful saints, ancient spirits, or forgotten pacts broken. In Venice, a nobleman once banned a public washing ritual at a small neighborhood fountain. Within a week, the water ran red, or so the letters claimed. The fountain was boarded up, and no one drank from it again. Even well-meaning repairs could go sideways. Renaissance engineers known as acquaioli often clashed with local priests. The priests insisted on blessings before any major plumbing work, especially if it involved rerouting springs or touching holy channels. Meanwhile, the engineers just wanted to fix the leak before the baker's floor flooded again. The result? Lots of passive-aggressive standoffs featuring incense chalk markings and muttered Latin. Some acquaioli carried charms with them, little metal discs engraved with St. John's symbol or old Roman protective motifs. Not for decoration, for safety. And in at least one case, a city halted a major aqueduct restoration because workers claimed to hear wailing inside the pipe. Probably wind. Probably. But fear doesn't care about probably. You pass a small shrine now wedged between two buildings. It's no bigger than a cabinet, but a candle flickers beside a tiny Virgin Mary statue, and beneath it is a spout, barely flowing. Just a whisper of water into a cracked dish. A sign reads, "Do not drink after dark." You don't. There's something about Renaissance plumbing that feels personal. Water was never just water. It could bless, curse, heal, or haunt. It could mark territory, reveal secrets, or test your soul. You didn't just drink it, you negotiated with it. And that's why fountains, unlike baths, became spiritual landmarks. Baths made you vulnerable, naked, immersed. But fountains, they were mediators between the earth and the divine, between the practical and the mystical. You didn't climb in. You bowed slightly. You waited your turn. You made sure your shadow didn't fall across the spout during a church bell toll because your grandmother once warned you that could cause warts. And even if you weren't superstitious, you acted like you were, just in case. Because what if that goat-eyed fountain really was watching you, You pass another group now, two men filling casks and a woman sprinkling rose petals into the basin. For scent, for luck, she doesn't say. But as she walks away, she whispers a name over her shoulder, Giovanni, and tosses a petal behind her. You don't ask why. You just nod. The water keeps flowing. The goat keeps staring. And somewhere deep beneath your feet, ancient pipes groan. Still carrying water. Still carrying stories. You make your way through a bustling morning market now where chickens complain loudly in baskets. Fishmongers argue over scales and price. And somewhere someone's singing off-key about onions. A sharp, briny breeze catches your nose part, sea air part, unwashed humanity, and you instinctively reach for your water flask. Bad idea, because here's the uncomfortable truth in Renaissance Italy: you didn't trust the water. Oh, sure, the fountains looked clean. They sounded clean. And in paintings, they're always crystal clear, and surrounded by angelic peasants bathed in golden light. But drink from the wrong source and you could spend your final days becoming a cautionary tale. You sidestep a puddle of something that is absolutely not rainwater and duck into a shaded square. At its center stands a grand fountain tiers of carved marble turtles spouting jets, and a top basin so high it splashes sunlight like diamonds. A true beauty. But are you drinking from it? Absolutely not, unless you're feeling brave or reckless or both. See, during the Renaissance, people were becoming increasingly suspicious of where their water came from. If it wasn't a spring-fed fountain, or if the supply lines were too long, too old, too Roman, or too close to a graveyard, forget it. Risky business, which is why, believe it or not, many people, especially the rich, chose to drink wine instead. Not just because it tasted better, but because it was safer. Fermentation killed off bacteria nobody could see, but everyone feared. Even children drank watered-down wine. Some physicians even recommended it over water, citing melancholic humors and toad-borne vapors. Yes, toad-borne, we don't have time. And so you drank wine. You cooked with wine. You washed wounds with wine. Some people even tried brushing their teeth with it, which probably worked as well as you'd expect. Historians still argue whether this widespread wine reliance was based on health taste or just the Renaissance's enthusiastic commitment to being mildly tipsy at all times. But water's suspicious, and baths even more so. Remember, bath water wasn't running fresh. You filled a wooden tub once with water that had been hauled by hand, heated by fire, and often shared by multiple people. You're not soaking in luxury. You're marinating in potential pathogens. Add to that the belief that pores opened during bathing, making your body vulnerable to bad air or miasma, and suddenly a bath sounded less like self-care and more like a tactical error. Better to dab your face at the fountain. Maybe wipe your hands with a damp cloth. Anything more might invite illness, or worse, gossip. You pass a pharmacy, a spezieria, its window cluttered with jars of dried herbs, colored powders, and little bundles of cloth labeled with cursive warnings. Inside, you spot a small sign that reads, "Spring water available. Boiled twice. Blessed once." Smart marketing. The idea that water needed to be purified not just physically but spiritually was common. Priests blessed fountains. Midwives used holy water in childbirth. And when the plague hit, as it often did, fountains were scoured, painted with protective symbols, or simply shut off altogether to avoid contamination. In one instance, a Florentine neighborhood closed a major fountain for 3 weeks after a goat drowned in it. Panic spread faster than the stench. People walked miles for other sources, even if it meant crossing rival turf. It was safer to stay thirsty than to drink from the wrong basin. And yet fountains still occupied the heart of every community. Why? Because they were visible. They were regulated. You saw who used them when how. You could judge gossip report or imitate. A fountain was public life compressed into marble and flow. Baths, on the other hand, were hidden, intimate, full of risks both sanitary and social. You remember hearing about that nobleman who built a private bath in his villa just outside Florence. Word got around that he used lavender oil. Scandalous. Soon people started asking questions. Who else used it? What did they do in there? Was it just him? Was there music? Within a month, the man had fallen from favor. Not for what he did, but for what people imagined he did while wet. Meanwhile, in the town center, old women ladled water over their vegetables in broad daylight, completely guilt-free. One anecdote, half fable, half truth, tells of a merchant who refused to drink from the family's private well. He insisted on walking to the public fountain daily, not for quality, but for credibility. He wanted everyone to see him fetching water like a good citizen. You walk now toward another fountain. This one a lion-headed spout with weathered features and moss blooming like a green beard beneath its mouth. A woman dips a jug, and as she waits for it to fill, she starts humming. Children skip nearby, their laughter echoing off the stones. This, more than anything, is what fountains provided community. They were spaces where people came together, where someone might drop news or bread or a sarcastic blessing, where people could be seen and counted and remembered. Baths were private. Fountains were participatory. Even if you didn't fully trust the water, you trusted the ritual, and sometimes that was enough. You pause in a quiet corner of the city where a vine-wrapped loggia arches over an old stone bench. It's the kind of spot that feels like it's seen 1,000 whispered secrets, and probably 1,000 poorly aimed buckets of water. At its center is a modest little fountain, just a copper spout shaped like a dove, trickling into a square basin carved with faded floral motifs. It doesn't look like much, but the woman sitting beside it is chatting like she's on center stage. And that's when it hits you, this isn't just a fountain, it's a performance venue. Because in Renaissance Italy, fountains weren't just for drinking, they were for talking, for watching, for judging, and above all, for gossiping. You settle on the edge of the basin and listen in. The woman, wrapped in a worn shawl and armed with the kind of voice that could slice cheese, is recapping an argument from earlier that morning. It involves her neighbor's goat, a missing shoe, and accusations of witchcraft so casual it's like she's discussing the weather. A few others join her, another woman with a basket of carrots, a teen boy pretending not to listen, and an old man who might be asleep, but twitches every time someone says, betrayed. The fountain babbles softly, a perfect backdrop, because this was the Renaissance water cooler. Before cafes, before newspapers, before overheard on the tram, there was the public fountain. People didn't just stop here to fill jugs. They lingered, they traded recipes, they bragged, they eavesdropped, and most importantly, they shared news. Did you hear about the baker's apprentice? They say the wool merchant's daughter eloped with a lute player. I swear on St. Anthony, she washed her hair on a Wednesday again. Some of it was true. Most of it was, let's say, creatively enhanced. But either way it mattered. And the fountain was the amplifier. Historians still argue whether this public gossip culture contributed to Renaissance cities' social cohesion or to their endless factional bickering. Probably both. But no one disputes the role of the fountain as a narrative engine. You pass another group this time, children splashing their hands while their grandmother warns them not to waste the saint's water. She's not being metaphorical. Some fountains were believed to have miraculous properties depending on their origins. If a spring had once flowed near a saint's resting place or had healed someone's rash in 1427, word got around. People came not just for hydration, but for a little blessed luck. And if your neighbor got pregnant after sipping from the northern basin and not the southern one, well, that's enough to start a theological turf war. But even ordinary fountains developed reputations. Some were known for being cooler in summer. Others had sweeter water. A few were considered flirtation hotspots, particularly those where the prettiest girls fetched water for the wealthiest homes. And yes, the act of fetching water became its own form of theater. You didn't just grab a jug and go. You dressed the part. You chose your route carefully. You timed your visit to coincide with the right audience. One young noblewoman in Ferrara was rumored to make 4 trips a day each time with a new ribbon in her hair, purely to catch the eye of a merchant's son. They eventually married, probably thanks to strategic hydration. And the fountain witnessed it all. Because unlike bathhouses, which required privacy walls and awkward logistics, fountains were public. Intentionally public. You were meant to be seen. Not entirely unlike social media today, the Renaissance fountain created a shared, performative space where people curated their identity. Not with filters and hashtags, but with posture, timing, and the kind of jug you carried. A scratched-up clay pail said, "I'm here for business." A painted ceramic urn whispered, "My family owns vineyards." A bejeweled brass vessel shouted, "Please notice me, especially you, Antonio." You stop beside a trio of young men huddled near a small corner spout. They pretend to lean casually, but their eyes keep flicking toward a girl walking by. She pretends not to see them. The spout gurgles gently like it's chuckling at all of them. This was how relationships started. This was where alliances formed, where disputes were aired, and where reputations rose and fell, sometimes hourly. One famous case in Bologna involved a woman who deliberately spilled her jug at the fountain just as her rival arrived. "So sorry," she said, "but I suppose some of us have to fetch water twice a day." Burn delivered, witnesses secured. Even the city's administrators knew this was happening. In some neighborhoods, public officials were assigned to monitor fountains not just to check on water flow, but to maintain order. After all, if the local fountain turned into a screaming match or an impromptu poetry duel, yes, those happened things could escalate fast. There were reports of insults hurled across marble basins, lovers caught making moon eyes behind the statue of Neptune, and on one glorious occasion, a surprise wedding proposal involving a piglet, a lute, and a basket of lemons. Fountains didn't just reflect civic life, they created it. They offered a space where everything intersected gender, class, religion, romance, and the occasional pickpocket. No bathhouse could have done that. A bath was quiet, steamy, secluded. The kind of place where drama happened after the gossip was already over. But the fountain, it was the source of the story. You dip your fingers into the cool stream and let the water run through your hands. Someone behind you is talking about the new baker who doesn't rise before dawn. Scandalous. Someone else is arguing about taxes. You smile. You don't need a newspaper. You've got the fountain. The sun is higher now, and the stone streets have warmed enough to bring out the more fragrant layers of Renaissance city life. Cured meats, horse dung, and the occasional waft of roasted chestnuts from a vendor tucked in the shadows. You round a corner and come face to face with a building that looks like it's either been abandoned for a century or very poorly disguised as a warehouse. Its wooden door is shut. The windows are boarded. But above it, barely legible through the soot and rain-streaked plaster, you can make out the faded words. Bagni pubblici? Public baths. Or rather, what's left of one. Because here we are finally at the part of the story everyone tries to pretend didn't happen, how bathhouses became brothels or were at least accused of it, and how that turned public hygiene into a moral war zone. You'd be forgiven for assuming that every Renaissance city had a functioning bathhouse on every corner, steam curling out of doorways, rosy-cheeked citizens scrubbing away under mosaic ceilings. But by the 15th century, most of these places were either shuttered, scandalized, or officially repurposed as places to store barrels and awkward rumors. What happened? In short association, bathhouses had once been noble, communal, even monastic. Many medieval bathhouses had separate hours for men and women, and some monasteries maintained small hot water rooms for monks and pilgrims. But as urban life exploded, so did the blurry boundaries between bathing and body behavior. Mixed gender bathing wasn't unheard of in earlier centuries, especially in parts of Germany or Central Europe. But in Italy, by the time the Renaissance dawned, any space that involved exposed, skin-damp rooms and close proximity quickly slid down a slippery slope of suspicion. And if there's one thing Renaissance cities were great at, it was public suspicion. One letter from a Roman merchant describes a bathhouse frequented more by musicians and idle men than by good Christians, and laments that the soap is outnumbered by sin. A Venetian ordinance from 1437 outright declared that any bathhouse operating after sunset was to be considered suspect, and its owner could be fined or imprisoned. Just in case someone was secretly laundering more than laundry. Historians still argue whether this moral crackdown was driven by real corruption or just a handy excuse to shut down an institution that was falling apart anyway. Because let's be honest, public baths were expensive. Heating water took firewood, a lot of it. Tubs needed scrubbing, water needed replacing. Plumbing systems, if you could call them that, needed patching often with materials no more durable than papier-mâché and medieval hope. So when rumors swirled that bathhouses were breeding grounds not just for scandal, but for disease, well, that sealed the deal. Yes, let's not forget the ever-present fear of plague. With the Black Death still echoing through every generation, people were deeply wary of places where large numbers of wet, half-naked citizens mingled in steamy rooms with poor ventilation. In the logic of the day, bathhouses weren't sanctuaries, they were spore chambers. You stop in front of the boarded-up door and peek through a crack in the wood. Dust, darkness, maybe a pigeon. You imagine what this place might have looked like 100 years earlier. A marble basin, murals of dolphins, maybe even scented oils in ceramic jars if you were lucky. And now, condemned, forgotten. So what filled the void? Fountains. They didn't invite moral panic. They didn't require expensive heating. And crucially, they weren't places where people got naked. That made them far easier to defend, fund, and celebrate. A family could donate a fountain and be praised as virtuous patrons of public welfare. Try doing that with a steam room and see how quickly the church sends someone with questions. Still, bathhouses didn't completely vanish. In wealthier homes, private bathing tubs did exist, usually large wooden or metal tubs filled by servants with buckets of warm water. The rich could afford the luxury of being clean in secret. There's a famous letter from Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, ordering a perfumed bath after a long ride. The tub was to be filled with rose petals warmed by coals and covered by a screen, so she could bathe without the immodesty of exposure. Even in cleanliness, modesty remained king, but for the common people, forget it. Their options were dab themselves at a fountain like a decorative pigeon, pay for a risky private bath that might be shut down any day, or just deal with it and maybe rub some lavender on their armpits. It's no surprise then that people slowly stopped asking about the baths. They disappeared from civic budgets, from architectural plans, from memory, and fountains once second best became first place by default. You continue walking and pass a street musician singing a love ballad. His lyrics include the line, "I would build you a bath, but they'd call me a sinner." The woman listening laughs. She gets it. Baths weren't romantic anymore. They were complicated. But fountains were still safe, sacred, and at least moderately splashable. And maybe that was enough. You're in the artisan district now, where every third doorway hosts a workshop, and every second building seems to be held together with scaffolding and stubbornness. The air is filled with the clink of chisels, the groan of wooden carts, and the faint, familiar splash of water. Always, always, the water. And in front of you now is something that could only have been made during the Renaissance, a ridiculously over-designed fountain. It's shaped like a griffin. No, wait, 2 griffins. Wrestling with a mermaid, who is also holding a cornucopia that's doubling as a waterspout. All of it is carved from marble so white it practically glows in the sun. You stare, you blink. You consider that maybe it's a bit much. But that's the thing, architects in Renaissance Italy went absolutely wild with fountains. At first, fountains had been about function. Roman ones, medieval ones, they were simple. spouts troughs, maybe a carved head if you were feeling fancy. But once the Renaissance hit, function became secondary. A fountain was no longer just a place to fill your jug. It was a canvas, a competition. A stage for architects, sculptors, and engineers to show off who could make the most dramatic splash, sometimes literally. Take Filippo Brunelleschi, for example. You probably know him for the dome of Florence's Duomo, one of the most breathtaking architectural feats in Europe. But he also dabbled in hydraulics, one of his lesser-known inventions, a device that combined water flow with mechanical movement, essentially creating a primitive animated fountain. It was never widely adopted, probably because it malfunctioned and soaked a monk during a trial run, but the ambition was there. Artists wanted to move water in ways that inspired awe, not just utility. And so across cities like Florence, Rome, and Naples, fountains began popping up that looked more like mythological fever dreams than plumbing. Historians still argue whether this shift in fountain design was driven by civic pride, private vanity, or just a surplus of unemployed sculptors. Probably all three. You pass a smaller fountain now tucked between a woodcarver's stall and a silk shop. This one's simpler, just a lion's head over a bowl, but someone's added a cherub to the top since your last visit. It's made of copper and looks confused, as if even he doesn't know what he's doing there. That's part of the charm. Fountain design in the Renaissance was gloriously inconsistent. Some were symmetrical masterpieces, others looked like a sculptor sneezed in the middle of carving and just went with it. And the materials: stone from local quarries, marble shipped from Carrara, bronze fittings, even bits of old Roman sarcophagi recycled into basins. You know, for that refined death chic aesthetic. And it wasn't just city commissions. Private patrons got involved too. Wealthy families would fund elaborate public fountains to show their status. A sort of look, what I can do with water, and money move. But some went even further, commissioning their own fountains for private courtyards. There's a story of a merchant in Bologna who built a fountain modeled after the biblical flood, complete with tiny carved animals' arcs and a thundercloud that wept actual water from a pipe hidden in the ceiling. Overkill, absolutely. But in a time when art, religion, and plumbing could be braided together into civic theater, why not? And sometimes these fountains were meant to surprise. In courtly gardens, it wasn't uncommon to find scherzi d'acqua water jokes, hidden mechanisms that sprayed unsuspecting visitors as part of an elaborate prank. You can almost hear the noblemen cackling behind their velvet sleeves. One letter from a Medici cousin describes such a prank: a statue of a faun that squirted water from its nose when someone picked a nearby flower. The victim was drenched with heavenly laughter, the letter claims, though you suspect heavenly is doing a lot of work there. But even as fountains became more theatrical, they never stopped being useful. They remained crucial sources of water for drinking, cooking, and washing. They just did it with more flair than necessary. And of course, with great flair came great maintenance headaches. Engineers had to figure out how to keep water flowing through increasingly elaborate channel spouts and pools, often using gravity alone. Pressure needed to be balanced, pipes kept clean, and sculpture repaired when the occasional wing or snout fell off. And let's not forget pigeons. They had no appreciation for art. They appreciated ledges. And every winged cherub eventually became a restroom. Still, these fountains persisted, because in a Renaissance city, a grand fountain was a sign you mattered. It was visual proof that your city, your family, or your patron could afford not just water, but beauty. And that beauty could be public, open, and as extra as you pleased. You stop in front of one last masterpiece before moving on a tall, twisting column crowned with Poseidon himself trident, in one hand water arcing from his open mouth. Around the base, 4 horses rear each, gushing their own stream into a shimmering pool. A small boy stands by with a bucket half his size, staring at it like he's seeing the sea for the first time. And maybe in a way he is. Because that's what these fountains were: visions of a controlled, abundant world. They promised order, flow, beauty. Even if the rest of the city was chaos, no bath could compete with that. The midday sun has settled into a golden hum, and shadows are retreating into alleyways like cats napping until dusk. The city feels full now, every piazza bustling, every cart rattling, every bell marking time. And in the center of it all always is a fountain doing more than just being a fountain. You've come to a particularly extravagant one situated in front of a civic building covered in frescoes and creeping ivy. The fountain itself is absurdly lovely, a tall pedestal of marble upon which perches a reclining river god, muscled and moody, holding an urn that spills a constant curtain of water into a circular basin below. Around him, 4 figures twist upward nymphs, maybe or abstract metaphors for seasonal produce. It's not just a water source, it's an art installation, a stage, a symbol, and perhaps most importantly, an invitation to stare. Because by the late Renaissance, fountains had transformed into public sculpture galleries you could splash in. Unlike paintings which lived indoors or religious art, which was cloistered in chapels, fountains brought the same artistry into the street. If you couldn't afford a Botticelli on your wall, you could still admire a Neptune blowing bubbles over your lunch. Fountains democratized beauty, at least in theory. You lean against the basin. It's cool to the touch, slightly damp from overspray. A young couple is sitting on the opposite edge, their feet nearly dipping into the water, as they argue gently over which mythological figure the top statue is supposed to be. She says it's Hera. He insists it's some obscure river goddess with excellent abs. And this is exactly the kind of debate the sculptor wanted. These works weren't just decoration, they were narrative puzzles. Every symbol, every gesture, every turtle under a foot had a story. A message. A message that might be personal, political, or poetically vague. Take the famous Fountain of the Tortoises in Rome, for example. 4 adolescent bronze figures hold up a basin while tiny turtles peek over the edge. It's whimsical, elegant, playful. And for centuries, people have argued over what it means. Is it about time, youth, balance, aquatic confusion? Historians still debate whether the inclusion of tortoises was symbolic, stylistic, or just the artist's way of trolling future generations. And that's the joy of it. Fountains were riddles you could drink from. You pass a merchant setting up his fruit stall in front of a smaller fountain shaped like a boy strangling a goose. It sounds gruesome, but somehow the water pouring from the bird's open beak makes it adorable. People drop coins into the basin not for wishes, but for fun. The merchant says the fountain brings luck to pairs, whatever that means. You've started to notice how every neighborhood has its own fountain personality. In the upper districts, there's stern and classical gods, lions, saints, and coats of arms. In the market quarters, they're humorous goats making funny faces, chubby cherubs, frogs spitting with unashamed force. In the student districts, rude graffiti, cheeky symbols, and statues that have definitely lost some modesty to local sculptors, with too much time and not enough supervision. Because here's the thing, the city was in on the joke. Civic leaders knew that fountains weren't just infrastructure. They were propaganda. They were entertainment. They were a way to remind people that water, while essential, could also be inspiring. Some city festivals even used fountains as theatrical backdrops. Cloth would be draped candles, lit flowers strewn across basins. On holidays, you might even find colored water flowing reds and blues from natural dyes or berry infusions. In one famous celebration in Florence, a fountain was rigged to pour wine for an hour. It attracted an enthusiastic crowd, and probably a few lawsuits. But beneath all the whimsy, the deeper truth remained. Public art was most powerful when it was useful. You didn't need to visit a cathedral to see beauty. You just needed to be thirsty. And this didn't go unnoticed by artists. Sculptors like Giambologna, who created the famous Fountain of Neptune in Bologna, saw these commissions as more than technical challenges. They were ways to be seen, remembered, even adored. The fountain gave them an audience far broader than any private commission ever could. And it wasn't just about carving something pretty. The artist had to consider water flow, pressure, direction, texture, light, pigeons. One miscalculation and Neptune's trident might dribble instead of stream. Or worse, spray someone directly in the eye during Mass. You stop beside a boy who's sketching a fountain in charcoal. His paper is smudged, but his focus is absolute. You ask him why this one, and he shrugs. It looks like it wants to move. That's it, isn't it? These weren't static sculptures. They moved. They glittered. They sounded like laughter and whispered stories. They caught the sun, reflected the moon, and gave life to stone. You start to think that fountains didn't just fill the gap left by abandoned bathhouses, they elevated public water into something sublime. The bath was private, functional, ephemeral. The fountain was forever, and it still is. The afternoon wears on and your sandals are beginning to complain. Your route has taken you into a quieter district far from the grand piazzas and ostentatious basilicas. Here the walls are cracked, the shutters sun-bleached, and the fountains are looking a bit dodgy. You approach one now, a rusted pipe jammed into the side of a leaning building dribbling into a half-buried basin surrounded by weeds. The water runs, but just barely. A man walks up with a bucket muttering. He gives the pipe a solid whack with a stick. It groans. The flow sputters to life just long enough to splash his sandals before dying again. He glares at it like it owes him money. This isn't rare. In fact, it's a perfect example of the murky underworld behind Renaissance fountains. The guild rivalries, bribery rings, and shady maintenance practices that made water flow in the first place. Because here's the dirty little secret, no one trusted the plumbers. Oh, they were essential, of course. No one denied that. But essential doesn't mean beloved. The people responsible for maintaining fountains, laying lead pipes, and keeping the water clean operated in a strange, semi-respected limbo. They were called acquaioli or fontanieri, depending on the city. In theory, they were professionals trained in the delicate balance of gravity pressure and material. In practice, they were often treated with the same suspicion you'd give a man selling miracle eel tonic out of a cart, and the systems they worked on ancient, unpredictable, and often patched together from leftover Roman aqueducts, medieval hacks, and very creative guesses. Historians still argue whether these workers were truly corrupt or simply overwhelmed by impossible expectations and collapsing infrastructure. Probably both. Here's how it worked. Each city had its water office, a bureaucratic nightmare of scribes, inspectors, and overseers. In Florence, it was the Ufficio del Fontane. In Rome, it fell under papal jurisdiction. And Venice, of course, had its own Byzantine council of hydraulic experts. These offices hired local guilds, usually the Plumbers Guild or Masonry Guild, to maintain specific sections of the water network. And here's where the fun begins. Because these guilds were territorial, a fountain broke. You couldn't just call any plumber. You had to call the one whose guild controlled that particular section, even if they lived across town, even if they were terrible, even if they were unavailable because their cousin was marrying into the goat bone trade that weekend. Rivalries between guilds led to delays, sabotaged repairs, and in one infamous case, a fistfight in front of a statue of St. Lawrence after a pipe replacement turned into a turf war. You pass another fountain, this one slightly more intact with a lizard carved into the side. A young boy is fiddling with the spout using what looks like a spoon and a great deal of hope. He's not supposed to be doing that. But here's the thing. Private citizens often had to fix fountains themselves. Why? Because official repairs took weeks, if not months, unless you greased the right palm. And boy, were there palms to grease. Want your fountain fixed by Easter better, slip the inspector a wedge of cheese or a prayer card with something extra tucked inside. Want your neighborhood's water pressure to be accidentally stronger than your rivals. That'll cost you, but it can be arranged. There's a document from 1492 detailing a pipe pressure alteration in Rome that was clearly just a veiled bribe to reroute more water to a bishop's garden. The paper trail ends with the words, "Flow adjusted. Civic harmony preserved." Sure, guys. Some neighborhoods tried to work around this by forming unofficial maintenance crews, volunteer teams who patched leaks, reinforced joints with rags, and occasionally held bake sales to fund emergency repairs. The city responded poorly. Why? Because control of water was control of power. You couldn't just go fixing fountains. That implied the city wasn't in charge. And in the Renaissance, appearances mattered more than water pressure. In Venice, citizens caught repairing a public spout without permission could be fined or amusingly assigned public disgrace duties. One man was forced to wear a bucket on his head for a day while walking in circles around the Piazza San Marco. It caught rainwater. Very efficient. And let's not forget the materials involved. Lead pipes were the norm. Easy to shape, durable, and, as we now know, slowly toxic. People occasionally noticed side effects, lethargy, memory issues, blackened teeth. But back then it was chalked up to melancholy or an excess of wet humors. No one blamed the pipes. Some fountains used bronze spouts, which corroded slower but were more expensive. Others featured wooden channels, especially in poorer districts, cheaper, yes, but they rotted quickly and leaked constantly. It was a patchwork system, held together by tradition, guesswork, and the prayers of whoever happened to be standing closest when it failed. You pause at another fountain. This one surprisingly ornate, given the surrounding neighborhood. A pair of dolphins curled into a spiral, mouths agape, the water flow slightly crooked. You suspect one dolphin is jealous of the other. It happens. A plaque beside it reads, "Restored 1472, broken 1474, restored again 1476, funding pending." You can't help but laugh, because that's Renaissance plumbing in a nutshell. Grand, glorious, and just a little bit broken. You leave the city's outer fringes and walk back toward the center, following the hum of voices, the uneven clack of hooves on cobblestones, and of course, the unmistakable gurgle of yet another fountain. This one is different, though. Tucked beside a small chapel and under the shade of an olive tree, it feels quieter, older, like it's trying not to be noticed. Which is ironic considering this next chapter in the story, how diseases and the fear of them completely changed how people thought about water. Because if there's one thing the Renaissance truly feared even more than a poorly carved cherub or an overdue tax, it was getting sick. And while we now know that hygiene and sanitation are key to disease prevention back then, the understanding was murkier than a well after a festival. To many, illness didn't come from germs, it came from bad air or miasma. It drifted in through windows, rose from wet ground, or clung to unwashed bodies. And ironically, sometimes the very places meant to clean you. The baths were thought to be the most dangerous of all. Yes, we're back to the bathwater of doom. You've probably guessed it already, but communal bathing was the perfect storm. Warm, moist, crowded, and full of human skin flakes. In the 15th century, that combination started to look less like relaxation and more like plague starter kit. So people stopped going. And fountains. They stepped in not as a solution, but as a safe alternative. Because unlike the still steamy air of a bathhouse, fountains offered flowing water, movement, air circulation. You could approach them, dab yourself, fill a jug, and leave. No lingering, no sweating, no bodily contact. Historians still argue whether this pivot to fountains was truly health-driven, or if it simply aligned with already changing moral and economic conditions. But the timing pretty suspicious, especially when plague season rolled around. When outbreaks occurred, public bathhouses were often the first places to close. Authorities posted warnings, priests held processions, and city councils issued bans on large public gatherings, including soapy ones. Fountains, on the other hand, were rarely shut off. Some were even blessed during times of panic. You can find records from Florence, Siena, and Venice describing ceremonies where holy water was sprinkled into city fountains to purify the flow. Did it help? Probably not. Did it make people feel better? Absolutely. You stop beside a woman rinsing a handful of rosemary sprigs in the basin. She murmurs a prayer under her breath, then tucks the herbs into her sleeve like armor. She's not alone. Everybody has their rituals. One baker you passed earlier threw salt into the water before filling his pail. A courier refused to draw water during shadow hour when the sun hit the basin just right. And an apothecary you overheard claimed that only north-facing fountains yielded truly clean water. Were these beliefs grounded in science? No. Were they deeply followed, you bet? Because when you don't understand disease, water becomes both savior and suspect. Some fountains gained reputations as healing springs. People flocked to them. Others were thought to carry illness and were avoided like cursed crossroads. There's a case from Perugia where a neighborhood blamed an outbreak of fever on a newly built fountain. The city had rerouted a spring from an old burial site, never a good move, and locals swore the water was haunted by unquiet bones. The fountain was smashed within a week. The fever, unfortunately, did not leave with it. And in Rome, during one particularly brutal cholera season, people lined up at the Fontana dell'Acqua Paola to collect what they called virgin water, convinced it came from a source untouched by sin or sickness. In reality, it came from an aqueduct barely held together by prayers and marble patch jobs. But here's the contradiction: even as fear of illness grew, people didn't start bathing more, they bathed less, because water wasn't seen as cleansing in the way we understand it now. Instead, many believed it opened the body to danger. Wet skin was vulnerable skin. It let bad air in. It destabilized humors. It weakened your natural resistance. In a 1478 medical tract, a doctor writes, "Better a dry man with an unpleasant scent than a sweet one stewing in peril." A little dramatic maybe, but the message was clear. Cleaning yourself could kill you. So what did people do instead? They leaned on dry hygiene, combing hair, brushing clothing, changing linens occasionally, and crucially perfuming everything. You walk past a perfumer's stall now. It smells like rosemary, myrrh, rosewater, and desperation. The shopkeeper cheerfully offers you a vial of plague-preventing lavender tincture. You decline, but only just, because that was the new logic: smell good, stay healthy. Stink, and you were probably infected. Clean clothes were more about social survival than medical fact. And through it all, the fountains kept flowing. You pass one now with a statue of an angel holding a small bowl. Someone's tucked a sprig of sage into its hand. There's a sense of hope there. Or maybe habit. Maybe both. Because when the world felt sick and the baths felt cursed, fountains became more than plumbing. They became shrines, symbols of the city still functioning, of beauty persisting, of water running despite everything. Not always safe, not always clean, but present. And in an age terrified of absence, that was enough. As the sun begins to tilt westward, the shadows in the piazza lengthen and the marble at the center of it catches fire in the golden light. You've reached one of the grandest fountains in the city, and this one bears an unmistakable mark: the triple tiara, the crossed keys, and a Latin inscription that all but shouts who paid for it. The Pope, because when it came to water in Renaissance, Italy, few players were bigger, richer, or thirstier for prestige than the papacy. And nowhere was that thirst more literal or symbolic than in the construction of fountains. This one, it wasn't built for the people's convenience. It was built to remind everyone that Rome's most powerful plumber wore a mitre. Welcome to the holy headline-making world of papal plumbing politics. It might surprise you, but for centuries, popes were obsessed with aqueducts. Not just fixing them, but owning them, controlling them, using them to broadcast spiritual and political power across the eternal city and beyond. And honestly, who could blame them? The ruins of ancient Roman engineering were lying around like trophies from a lost world. Restoring them wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It said, "Look, we can do what the Caesars did and maybe better." So starting in the late 1500s and peaking into the early 1600s, yes, a little beyond the strict Renaissance, but we're in the flow now, a series of popes launched massive efforts to reclaim and revive Rome's crumbling aqueducts. One of the most famous Pope Sixtus V, who in 1585 began restoring the Aqua Felice, a once dead aqueduct he named after himself, humility, was not the aesthetic. It brought fresh water to Rome's hills again and supplied dozens of fountains, including the lavish Fontana dell'Acqua Felice, which features Moses looking rather irritated as water trickles around him. And even though the engineering was complex, the politics were simple. Control, the water control, the city. Popes weren't just spiritual leaders, they were kings of a papal state. And by physically shaping the infrastructure, especially public, highly visible infrastructure like fountains, they could influence everything from urban development to public morale. Historians still debate whether these projects were more about civic virtue or vanity. Probably both. After all, slapping your name onto a gushing marble masterpiece that quenches the thirst of pilgrims and priests alike is a pretty great way to leave a legacy. You walk past another fountain now, this one smaller and nestled in the side of a building. Above the spout, a faded crest, and below it, a carved date, 1490, the tail end of a decade when popes were throwing gold at everything from chapels to chalices to, yes, plumbing systems. But here's the juicy bit: these projects weren't just religious or architectural. They were often deeply competitive. Popes competed with each other, restoring bigger aqueducts, commissioning taller fountains, sculpting more elaborate basins. But they also competed with noble families who were busy funding their own fountain statues and plazas. It became a kind of aquatic arms race. One pope's dolphin fountain begat a cardinal's three-tiered lion fountain, which begat a Medici-funded masterpiece with 12 cherubs riding seahorses. And each one sent a message our house provides. Our God, our family, our city, we feed you, we refresh you, we matter. And woe to the neighborhood that lost papal favor. When the water was flowing, your fountain was a symbol of divine connection. When it dried up, that was either a political slight or a technical problem no one wanted to admit. In fact, there's a record of Pope Gregory XIII being petitioned by an entire Roman neighborhood whose fountain had gone dry. They wrote not to the engineer, but to the Pope himself, begging him to restore the river of God's grace to their street. Because by then, fountains were religious metaphors too. Water symbolized purity, renewal baptism. A functioning fountain suggested spiritual health. A broken one, not great optics. That's why so many fountains were flanked by saints, apostles, and angels, not just for decoration, but as reassurance. It's not just water you're receiving, it's blessed water. Not holy water per se, but water made holy by the fact that it flows in public flows, in beauty flows from a pope's purse. You pass a young priest filling a jug. He pauses, crosses himself, then lets the water run over his hands before taking a sip. Maybe it's habit, maybe superstition, but you get the sense that he trusts this water more than he would from any well. Even when Rome was crumbling, politically unstable, crisscrossed by power-hungry cardinals and scheming nobles, the fountains kept flowing. That meant something. That still means something. But here's the most ironic twist: despite all the effort poured into these papal fountains, despite the grandeur and ambition, they didn't bring back the bathhouses. The church still frowned on public bathing. The theology still linked nudity with temptation. And so, even as clean papal blessed water trickled through newly restored aqueducts, nobody soaked in it. They admired it, sipped it, worshipped beside it, but bathed never. Fountains were sacred, baths were suspect. So popes built aqueducts to remind people of spiritual grace and civic order. But they didn't dare bring back the big communal tubs of ancient Rome. They might have restored the plumbing, but they didn't restore the culture of bathing, and so the people drank in beauty and went home sweaty. You wander through a winding street that slopes lazily downhill, sunlight bouncing off the uneven rooftops like it's playing its own slow-motion game of bocce. You've passed a dozen fountains by now, some grand, some humble, a few so old they look like they've accepted their mossy fate, and yet not a single bathhouse in sight. But here's the strange thing, other parts of Europe, they still had them. Take the Ottoman Empire, for example. In Constantinople, across the glittering mosques and domed palaces, hammams were alive and steamy. Beautiful marble bathing complexes filled with warm water, hot stones, perfumed towels, and a centuries-old love of ritual cleanliness. Public bathing was not only tolerated, it was celebrated. Likewise, in the Islamic world more broadly, from Moorish Spain to Cairo, bathhouses were seen as spiritually purifying and socially vital. A clean body, a clean soul. You weren't just allowed to bathe, you were expected to. And yet here in Italy, the cradle of artistic rebirth, the land of Leonardo and Botticelli, the one place where you can't walk 5 feet without tripping over a statue of someone with abs. Bathing was basically taboo. Why? Because somewhere along the line, Renaissance Italy decided that bathing was foreign, and foreign, dear listener, was dangerous. You pass a merchant now hawking bolts of silk and muttering to his assistant about those Moors and their ridiculous soap. It's not exactly subtle. That was the attitude to bathe like a Turk was seen as indulgent, suspicious, un-Italian. And anything that smacked of non-Christian, non-Latin customs was eyed with caution, at best condemnation, at worst. Historians still debate how much of this aversion was genuine fear, and how much was the result of cultural friction between East and West. But one thing's clear, Italy didn't just stop bathing. It actively rejected the idea of bathing like the others. You stroll past a crumbling fresco on a garden wall. It depicts a muscular figure, Hercules, maybe pouring water over his own head. But the water has flaked away with time, so now it just looks like he's patting himself awkwardly on the shoulder. And that, too, kind of sums it up. Water for public use remained barely. Water for personal cleansing disappeared. In some circles, even owning a tub became a signal of vanity or decadence. If you had a bath carved into your villa floor, you were suspect. What else were you doing in there? Drinking saffron wine and reading Greek poetry. Shocking. There's a famous letter from a Florentine noblewoman to her cousin in Venice complaining, "They say my copper basin makes me Turkish. I say it makes me less itchy." Iconic. But still, the pressure to avoid foreign habits was real. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Milan styled themselves as heirs to Roman greatness, and the Romans had bathed, yes, but they were ours. Turks, Moors, and even the French, no. Their baths were exotic, soft, sinful. So Italy doubled down on the alternative fountains. Public, proud, symbolic. Italian. Fountains were safe because they were sculptural, artistic, tied to civic glory, not physical vulnerability. You didn't have to undress. You didn't have to share a steam room. You just admired the marble and sipped a little water and maybe judged whoever stood too long at the spout. You pass a group of men gathered around a corner fountain shaped like a lion swallowing a snake. It's aggressive. So is the conversation. They're debating taxes or olives or both. Nobody's bathing. Obviously. And that's the thing, you could talk near a fountain. You could flirt, argue, preach, perform. You couldn't do any of that in a bath. At least not publicly. Not without some serious side eyes. There were exceptions, of course. Wealthy Italians who traveled to the east or to spa towns in France or Germany often came back with an appreciation for bathing. Some even had private bathrooms built, quietly, but they didn't talk about it. It wasn't fashionable. In fact, as Italy grew more obsessed with perfume powder and fabric water, became almost unnecessary. You didn't need to wash if you smelled good. if your sleeves were starched, if your ruff held up. Cleanliness became a matter of visual cues, not actual soap. And so, while the rest of Europe, and certainly the Islamic world, continued scrubbing away in steamy halls filled with laughter and lather, Renaissance Italians decided to elevate their fountains and bury their baths. You pause at the next square. The fountain here is simple but elegant, a single stream pouring from a bronze swan into a clear pool. A small sign hangs nearby. Don't wash clothes in the basin, please. Which means, of course, that someone has. Because even with all the judgment, all the performance, all the cultural posturing, people still needed water. Still needed some way to clean their linens, their faces, their pots. They couldn't bathe, but they could sneak around the edge of bathing. A rinse here, a foot dip there, a jug filled and carried home warm from the sun. They may have turned up their noses at hammams and steam, but they couldn't live without their fountains. And so Italy chose spectacle over steam, marble over muslin, dry over damp. And in doing so, they carved a very specific identity. We are Renaissance. We are not foreign. We build fountains. We do not bathe. You're walking now through a street that feels like a stage set between acts, empty, echoing slightly with the faint trace of laughter left in the air. There's a low hum in the distance. Not voices, not bells, water. You turn the corner and find yourself face to face with a small marble plaza alive with activity. Lanterns swing above your head. Fabric canopies ripple gently overhead. And in the center, a fountain. But this isn't a sleepy neighborhood trickle. This is an event. Jets of water leap into the air, syncopated like they're keeping time with the tambourine clatter of a passing procession. Children squeal and dart under the droplets. A trumpet bleats somewhere. Someone's tossing flower petals into the basin. Welcome to one of the Renaissance's most underappreciated art forms, the choreographed spectacle of the fountain. Yes, fountains could be functional. And yes, they could be beautiful. But sometimes they were also theatrical experiences, entire performances built around water, its flow, its glint, its movement, its mystery. This wasn't just utility, this was stagecraft. And nowhere did this fusion of art engineering and sheer whimsical ambition shine more than in the public festivals of Renaissance cities. Imagine this, it's Corpus Christi, or the wedding of a duke, or the birthday of a particularly indulgent bishop. The streets are lined with garlands, the piazzas are packed, and in the middle of it all, the city unveils a temporary fountain, not one built of stone, but of wood cloth and illusion. One record from Florence describes an ephemeral fountain erected for a festival that featured water flowing from the teats of sculpted she-wolves, arcing across miniature bridges and cascading into trays of marzipan for children to grab. Yes, sugared marzipan fountains. The Renaissance was doing fine. You pass a young man fiddling with the base of a lion statue. He's adjusting a lever. You hear a clunk, a hiss, and suddenly the lion spits a stream of red-tinted water wine maybe, or juice. The crowd cheers. A girl shrieks. An old man wipes his mouth and asks whether the bishop is footing the bill, because sometimes during festivals, fountains really did pour wine. The Trevi Fountain's ancestor during a 15th century Roman celebration was reportedly made to dispense white wine from one side and red from the other. For exactly one afternoon, Rome was both hydrated and hammered. Historians still argue whether these wine fountains were frequent or just legendary exaggerations. Either way, the idea stuck. The idea that water didn't just have to serve, it could also amuse. And this wasn't limited to big cities. Smaller towns created mechanical fountains for local events, featuring animals that blinked saints, that wept, and even talking spigots, where the mouth of the fountain was fitted with hidden pipes, so that an actor could speak into it from behind a curtain. You pass another fountain now, this one modest, but with a hidden mechanism. A nearby boy drops a coin into a groove, and the statue above him rotates slightly, and lets out a soft, high whistle as water begins to spray in a wide arc. It's a prank. A few children clap. One gets wet. Laughter. Applause. A round of bread rolls shared from a vendor's basket. The fountain isn't a utility anymore. It's the star of the show. Because in a world before cinema, before electricity, before theme parks, a well-designed fountain could feel like magic. It blurred the line between the mechanical and the mystical. People knew there were pipes and pumps and levers, but they still half believed in angels doing the plumbing. There's a famous account from Siena where a traveling dignitary saw a festival fountain and declared it proof that the city's artists could make marble dance. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a reputation, a flex. And it wasn't just citizens who appreciated the show. Foreign visitors would send back letters home not about churches or military strength, but about fountains, about how a sculpted fish spouted water into a basin shaped like a clamshell, about how nymphs cried, about how water sang. You hear it now, plink, 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 like glass tapping against stone. Another fountain tucked in the garden of a nobleman's home has been rigged with thin copper pans. Water falls into them in order each one tuned to a different pitch. Not loud, but enough. A trickle of lullaby. It's not for hygiene, it's not for thirst, it's for awe. And here's what's funny. Even as fountains became increasingly theatrical, they never lost their seriousness. They were still civic markers, still political tools, still spiritual metaphors, but now they were also delightful. One letter from a visiting Englishman, completely bewildered, wrote, "They have fountains here that laugh. I do not trust it." You understand his confusion. Renaissance fountains had gone from basic Roman spouts to living poems in stone and copper, and at their most elaborate, they blurred the line between engineering and enchantment. The bathhouse, it could never. You walk past one last display before moving on. A marble cupid with a winking expression is perched above a double basin fountain. Someone has tied a ribbon around its ankle. The water dribbles down its back like a lazy sigh. It's not spraying wine today. No hidden mechanisms, no music. But still it feels like something might happen. And maybe that's the secret. Fountains were never just about what they did. They were about what they suggested. Potential, surprise, celebration, a performance, in water. You're walking slower now. The day is winding down, and so is the city. The once boisterous piazzas have softened to murmurs, baskets of fruit are now half empty, and vendors are packing up their stalls with the kind of quiet that says, "We'll do it all again tomorrow." But as you turn into a narrow residential lane, something new hits your nose. Not horses, not firewood, not garlic. Perfume. You pause. A breeze wafts by a trace of rose lavender, maybe even musk. You're not sure whether someone nearby just passed, or if it's coming from the open window of an apothecary, or maybe everyone. Because by the late Renaissance, as public baths remained banned and fountains stayed dry beyond the lips of their spouts, Italians embraced something else entirely: dry hygiene, or more accurately, aromatic denial. If you couldn't bathe, you could mask. If you couldn't clean, you could conceal. If you couldn't wash off the sweat and soot of city life, you could at least smell like you did. And thus perfume and powder became the daily ritual. You pass a noblewoman now draped in velvet face, pale with powder, a small pomander, a scented orb hanging from a chain on her belt. She walks gracefully but carefully, as if balancing more than just pride. She's perfumed like a garden at midnight, and that's exactly how she wants it. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance's love of fragrance was rooted in health fears, fashion trends, or sheer desperation. But everyone agrees they doused themselves like it was a national sport, and it wasn't just the rich. Even the poor had vinegar cloths scented with herbs and dabbed behind the ears or under the arms. Rosemary water, orange peel, even crushed mint leaves. If you couldn't afford fine powder, You made do with the local apothecary's off-brand lavender potion and a prayer. You reach a shop now, its wooden sign creaks gently in the breeze. Etched into it is a faded bottle and the words Spezie and Fragranze. Inside, jars of oils line the shelves like trophies, clove rose bergamot civet, and a mystery vial simply labeled Venetian air. You imagine what it was like for people in those days. Waking up in unwashed linens, changing into clothes worn yesterday and the day before, splashing a handful of fountain water on your face if you were lucky. And then, the transformation. Out comes the powder, the perfume, the silk handkerchief pre-soaked in violet oil. You weren't bathing, but you were becoming presentable. This was more than cosmetic. It was cultural. Cleanliness had become olfactory theater, and there was a hierarchy to it too. Scents became social signals. Musk was for men, rosewater for refined ladies. Lemon peel marked someone as a traveler or merchant. Patchouli bold, a little suspicious. Some carried scented gloves or tucked aromatic herbs into their hats. One Florentine banker's diary records his pride at commissioning a leather purse that smelled of lilies for 3 seasons straight. A Renaissance flex. You stroll past a young man adjusting his cloak who quickly pats a sprig of thyme into his collar as a woman approaches. He smiles. She fans herself. The moment lingers. And here's the irony: for all the attention paid to smell, people were still objectively filthy. But they didn't seem dirty, at least not to each other. They seemed powdered, masked, prepared, like characters in an endless play where the audience was everyone on the street and the costume was scent. You pass another fountain, this one neglected water sputtering just enough to wet the stones but not to fill a jug. A young woman crouches beside it, dabbing a cloth in the trickle and rubbing it behind her ears. She glances around. The move is discreet, almost secretive, because by now real water touching skin had become odd, suspicious, a little too intimate. It was safer to smell clean than to be clean. There were exceptions. New mothers, certain monastic orders, or patients recovering from illness might be given full-body rinses with herbs. But this was medical, or religious. It wasn't fashion. Bathing, ironically, became sacralized or marginalized, something for the ill, or the sinful, or those too eccentric to know better. So the masses perfumed. One anecdote, perhaps exaggerated but popular, tells of a Sienese nobleman who wore so much powdered ambergris that when he fainted in church, the smell lingered longer than the gossip about his collapse. Perfume even entered the language of flirtation. To be within her scent was a poetic way of describing attraction. A waft of clove oil could ignite rumors. A misplaced sachet of rosemary could cause a scandal. A forgotten handkerchief soaked in orange blossom might provoke a duel. You start to notice that even the fountains smell different. People toss herbs into their basins, rose petals, sage bundles, even wine on occasion, not for drinking but to freshen the stone. Fountains became part of the olfactory experience, not just wet, but fragrant, which makes sense. In a world where cleaning yourself with soap and water was suspect, the fountain had to adapt. And so it became a perfume altar, not for immersion, but for impression. The sounds of the city are quieter now, a soft rustle of skirts, the occasional bray of a distant donkey, a whisper of lavender on the breeze. The people around you aren't clean, but they are curated. Evening drapes the city in velvet now. Lamps sputter to life. A golden haze settles on the rooftops. The heat of the day is fading, but the stones still hold the warmth, and so do the people. You can feel it in the way they linger by open doorways, in how the conversations slow and drift, and in the quiet rituals that start to unfold as night comes on. You're standing beside a fountain that's barely a trickle, just a steady drip from the mouth of a cracked lion into a moss-soft basin. It's not grand. It's not blessed. It's not even particularly clean. But the woman kneeling next to it doesn't seem to mind. She fills a jug, halfway wraps it in cloth, and tucks it into a basket alongside a small clay pot. You catch a glimpse of something inside soap root. A rag. Maybe a bundle of dried mint. She's going to bathe. At home. In secret. And here at last is the quiet truth Renaissance Italy rarely put on the record: bathing never truly disappeared. It just went underground. You see, even after public bathhouses were shuttered and fountains turned into sculpted civic pride pieces, and the church labeled nakedness a spiritual hazard, people didn't stop wanting to feel clean. They just had to get creative. For the poor, this meant wiping down with damp cloths or sneaking a quick wash in a quiet corner of a courtyard. For the working classes, it might mean a wooden tub dragged out once a week, filled bucket by bucket with lukewarm water drawn from a local spout used by the whole household in order of age or importance. For the wealthy, private bathing came back, but cautiously. You pass the high wall of a merchant's house. Somewhere inside you hear the slosh of water, laughter, maybe a splash, but nothing too loud. Because if there's one thing the elite feared almost as much as plague, it was being seen as improper. Wealth bought privacy, but not total freedom. The architecture of many Renaissance homes included spaces that could be disguised small chambers off the kitchen, where tubs could be filled, washed in, and emptied before guests arrived. Some even had drainage holes cleverly hidden or repurposed from ancient Roman plumbing. Historians still debate how widespread private bathing actually was. Some say only a handful of households had the luxury. Others suggest it was surprisingly common, just extremely discreet. You approach a side street now. A boy walks by carrying a bucket. Steam curls from the top. Not much, but enough to notice. He sees you, looks away quickly, and hurries into a door that shuts too quietly for accident. He's delivering hot water, likely for someone's backroom soak. And why not? By the late Renaissance, especially in the larger cities, public morality had drawn such hard lines around what bathing meant people learned to walk the tightrope. They craved relief. They just didn't talk about it. Bathing became personal, domestic, unspoken. There's a letter from a noblewoman in 1497 who mentions almost as a side note, "And I took the rose bath with the girls, but only after Vespers and only behind the third curtain." You can practically hear her whispering as she wrote it. And among the clergy, some orders still bathed. Monks in warmer climates might rinse weekly. Nuns were sometimes granted spiritual ablutions on holy feast days. But again, modesty ruled. Even nuns bathed in shifts alone behind screens with a chaperone standing outside the door. You walk past a laundress's corner where a basin has been set beside a hearth. Steam rises. A young woman dips a cloth in it and presses it to her neck with a long exhale. She doesn't look around. She doesn't care if you see her. Because as public bathing disappeared, private moments of cleansing became small acts of resistance, a reclaiming of comfort, of dignity, of the body despite everything. And gradually bathing began to tiptoe its way back into fashion. It started in whispers. A nobleman who imported Turkish towels. A duchess who hosted aromatic soaks for her closest friends under the pretext of medical necessity. A physician who prescribed water-based therapy for melancholy, not at a public bath, of course, but in the privacy of one's garden. And slowly these whispers became less scandalous. Not respectable, not yet, but acceptable in some circles, especially as new science emerged. As books were written about circulation skin disease. As Renaissance thinkers began to explore the body with new fascination and fewer taboos. Cleanliness began to gain philosophical weight. Water once feared as an opening for sin or sickness began to be seen again as restorative. Baths were reimagined not as indulgent but as natural, soothing, even healthful. And so while public fountains kept flowing, watched, judged, admired, private tubs were quietly dusted off. You pass a courtyard where a marble basin lies under a fig tree. It's not a fountain. Not yet. But someone has filled it. A small cake of soap rests on the edge. A towel hangs nearby. Nobody says anything. Nobody needs to. The bath is back. Quietly, privately, carefully, but back. The sky is indigo now. The city exhales. A cat slips across a rooftop. Candles glow behind shuttered windows. And just ahead of you, one last fountain. It's nothing special. No grand lion, no winged cherubs, no shell-shaped basins. Just a squat stone block with a spout poking out like the nose of a tired dog. The water flows slow and steady, predictable, enduring. And it's this fountain quiet, unassuming a little crooked that says more than all the others. Because it's still here. So many things came and went in Renaissance Italy. Bathhouses collapsed, aqueducts broke morals, twisted and turned. Science bloomed, art soared, and the world reshaped itself in paint, marble, and powder. But through it all, the fountains stayed. They endured not because they were perfect, but because they were flexible. When the baths became sinful, fountains became symbolic. When water turned dangerous, fountains promised beauty. When perfume became the only hygiene people trusted, fountains became rituals, sources of scent and rhythm and public grace. You sit on the worn lip of the stone. There's a jug beside you. Someone left it behind, still wet at the mouth. And you think about all the hands that touched this fountain across the centuries. Maids, monks, merchants, children, rebels, artists, liars, lovers. They didn't all love the water. Some feared it, some cursed it, but they needed it. Historians still debate how Renaissance cities functioned without public bathing, how they justified perfuming over scrubbing, why they chose statues over soap. Some say it was religious shame. Others blame infrastructure, or fashion, or fear, or pride. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe they just liked to watch water more than they liked being wet, because fountains were visible, communal, artful, baths, private, vulnerable, suspicious. A fountain never asked you to undress. It asked you to gather, to look, to listen. And when everything else decayed, when bathhouses were boarded up and barbers gave up their wash basins and the only cleansing you trusted was between the lines of a prayer, the fountain kept gurgling. Today you can still find them. Some pristine, some overgrown. A few turned into tourist photo ops. Others ignored except by birds and memory. But they still flow, still mark the heartbeat of a neighborhood, still whisper stories through their spouts. Stories of forgotten engineers, of over-perfumed nobles, of children daring each other to touch the lion's tongue, of a merchant's wife rinsing apples before Mass, of a nun who passed by every morning just to hear it. And now your story joins them. You lean back against the stone, close your eyes, and let the sound wash over you. You're not clean, not by modern standards, but you are restored, calmed, like the city, like the fountain, like the people who made do with what they had, Waterstone, a little imagination, and somehow made it beautiful. And that's the story of why Renaissance Italy had so many fountains and so few baths. The wind down. Now let your breath slow. Let the sound of water settle in the back of your mind like a memory you didn't know you had. Imagine that fountain again, simple, timeless. The trickle and splash gentle and steady like the rhythm of sleep approaching. The streets are empty now. The last shutters have closed. A single candle flickers behind a window pane. You hear it all recede, the carts, the chatter, the footsteps, and in their place just the quiet hum of water finding its way through stone. You are still, you are safe. There is nothing left to do. If your mind wanders, let it. Like water weaving through a city, it will always return. Tonight the baths are gone, the perfume has faded, and only the fountain remains flowing through time, through silence, through dreams. And as you drift off, know that even in the strangest chapters of history, there was always something soft, something constant, like this moment. Good night.